The telegram arrived at Gideon Mercer's gate on a Tuesday morning, and it wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to every woman in Harlan County who had ever dared step foot on Mercer land. A public notice, printed and posted at the general store, the telegraph office, and the church door, declaring that any female who presented herself at the Mercer Ranch under the pretense of matrimonial interest would be turned away at gunpoint if necessary. Not escorted, not declined politely. Turned away at gunpoint. Harlan Voss, the land broker who had drafted the notice on Gideon's supposed behalf, had added a final line in bold ink. The Mercer Ranch requires no woman, no wife, and no softness. Any who disagree may test that conviction at their own peril. Women across 3 counties read that notice and felt their faces burn. Some with humiliation, some with fury, most with a quiet, simmering rage that had nowhere to go. If you've never heard this story before, stay close, because what happened next is the kind of thing that doesn't get written down in the official record books. It gets passed around kitchens and bunkhouses and front porches instead, one person at a time, until the whole territory knows it by heart. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single chapter. Leave a like and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has already traveled. Now let's begin. The winter of 1883 came down on the Wyoming territory like something that had been waiting its whole life to be cruel. It didn't announce itself the way most winters did, with a few sharp nights and a slow tightening of the air. It arrived all at once, a wall of gray pressing down from the north before October had finished its business. And by the first week of November, the ground was frozen solid 2 feet deep, and the wind off the mountains had a sound to it that the old-timers said meant the season was angry about something personal. Gideon Mercer had lived through 39 Wyoming winters. He did not fear this one. He stood at the front window of the main house, a house that had 11 rooms and exactly 1 person living in it, and watched the first real snow of the season begin to fall in the early afternoon. His coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago. He hadn't noticed. He was watching the tree line at the southern edge of his property with the same flat expression he gave to most things. Not hostile exactly, but not welcoming either. The face of a man who had decided a long time ago that the world generally brought problems rather than gifts, and had arranged his expectations accordingly. Behind him, somewhere in the back of the house, he could hear his foreman, Dale Pruitt, arguing with the new cook about the supply inventory. They'd been going back and forth for 10 minutes. Gideon had stopped listening after the first 30 seconds. "Mr. Mercer." Dale appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, 50 years old, built like a fence post, with a mustache that had gone entirely gray 3 years ago. "We got a situation at the south gate." Gideon didn't turn around. "What kind?" "Woman, on horseback. She's asking for shelter." That made him turn around. He looked at Dale the way he looked at things that didn't immediately make sense, with a slow, measuring patience that made most men uncomfortable. "Who is she?" "Don't know. She gave her name as Naomi Ashcroft, says she was traveling through toward Casper and got caught by the weather. Horse is struggling." Dale paused. "She doesn't look like trouble, boss. She looks cold." "They usually do," Gideon said. He reached for his coat on the hook by the door. Not because he had decided anything yet, but because the conversation needed to happen outside rather than through a foreman. He pulled his hat down low and walked out into the snow. She was still mounted when he reached the south gate, which surprised him. Most people in that kind of cold were already off their horses and pressed against whatever solid thing they could find. She sat straight in the saddle, her coat, a dark wool thing that had seen better years, dusted white along the shoulders and the brim of her hat. Her horse, a gray mare with a blaze on her nose, was shivering in a way that suggested she didn't have much time left before she went down. Gideon stopped 10 feet from the gate. "Ashcroft." The woman looked at him. She had dark eyes, and she wasn't young, mid-40s maybe, with the kind of face that had spent time outdoors and showed it. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that weren't from smiling. Her jaw was set with a particular kind of determination that he recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror. "Mercer," she said. "That's right. Your foreman said you might send me away." He was being generous with the word might. A beat of silence. The wind picked up and the snow thickened between them. "I'm not asking for much," she said. "One night in your barn. I'll sleep with the horses if that's what it takes. My mare needs to get out of this wind or she's going to founder." What were you doing traveling in this weather? I left Rawlins 3 days ago. The weather wasn't like this when I left. Where are you headed? Casper. I have a sister there. He looked at the horse. The mare was trembling, her head drooping. Whatever else was uncertain, the animal's condition was not. You can put the horse in the east barn, he said. There's a tack room off the side. You can sleep in there. She didn't thank him. She just nodded, like it was a business arrangement that had been settled fairly. That more than anything else she'd said or done was what made him watch her as she rode through the gate. I went back inside and forgot about her for approximately 2 hours. Then Dale came to find him in the study, where Gideon was working through a set of property records that had been irritating him for 3 days. The woman, Dale said. Gideon didn't look up. What about her? She asked if she could use the kitchen. Storm's not letting up. Looks like it's going to run through tomorrow. She said she'd cook supper in exchange. Gideon set down his pen. She asked. She didn't just walk in and assume. No, sir. She sent word through me. Said to tell you she doesn't expect charity and she doesn't give it either, but she's been traveling for 3 days and she'd like a real meal, and she's willing to work for it. He thought about that for a moment. Let her use the kitchen, he said. Tell her there are 6 men who need feeding besides me. Dale nodded and left. Gideon picked up his pen again, but he didn't write anything for another 10 minutes. She fed 7 men that night with what she found in the Mercer kitchen, which was not in good shape. The previous cook had quit 2 weeks ago after a disagreement with Gideon about the merits of a particular spice, and in the intervening time the pantry had been managed by a ranch hand named Burl, who believed that any meal requiring more than 1 pot was probably overcomplicating things. Naomi Ashcroft surveyed the kitchen without comment. She opened cabinet doors, checked the cold storage, found the flour and the salt and a smoked ham that hadn't been touched, and went to work. Gideon didn't go into the kitchen until it was nearly done. He came in for more coffee, genuine reason, not curiosity, he told himself, and stopped just inside the doorway. The kitchen smelled like food, real food, the kind that had been made with actual attention rather than basic necessity. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in the big pot, while a pan of biscuits sat cooling on the counter. She'd shed her coat and was working in a plain gray dress that was patched at one elbow. Her hair was pinned up in the back but coming loose on the right side, probably from the wind earlier. She didn't turn around, but she knew he was there. Coffee's on the left burner, she said. I moved it so it wouldn't burn. He poured his coffee, stood there a moment longer than necessary. What is that? He asked, meaning the pot. Bean soup with the ham and biscuits. She paused. And I found an onion at the back of the cold storage that hadn't gone off yet. I used that too. The men will eat anything. I noticed, she said, and there was something dry in her voice that wasn't quite humor, but wasn't hostility either. The biscuit tin was empty, and there was grease in the pan from something that happened at least 4 days ago. She finally turned around to look at him. When did your cook leave? 2 weeks ago. What have you been eating? He took a drink of his coffee. Things that didn't require much. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not pity, not judgment, something more neutral and observant than either. Then she turned back to the stove. Supper will be ready in 20 minutes. He left the kitchen and spent the walk back to his study trying to remember the last time someone had talked to him like that. Not with deference, not with nerves, not with the particular brightness that people put on when they were trying to impress him. Just straight. Like he was an ordinary man who had answered a question poorly and she was noting the fact for the record. The storm did not let up by morning. By the time Gideon was up and dressed at 5 o'clock, the wind had shifted and the snow was coming sideways, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees overnight. He looked out the window at the south pasture and couldn't see the fence line. When he got to the kitchen, Naomi Ashcroft was already there. She had been up longer than him. The stove was going, there was fresh coffee, and she was working through the supply inventory with a piece of paper and a pencil she'd found somewhere, making notes in a tight, precise hand. She looked up when he came in. The storm's worse, she said. I can see that. I won't be leaving today. No, he agreed. She went back to her list. Your supply situation is going to be a problem in about 10 days if the weather holds. You've got enough flour and salt and dried goods, but your fresh provisions are low, and some of what's in the cold storage shouldn't be trusted anymore. She tore the page off and set it on the table in front of the empty chair across from hers. I made a list. He sat down and looked at it. She had neat, careful handwriting, the kind that suggested someone who had been taught properly and had taken it seriously. "You went through my cold storage," he said. "You asked me to cook supper. I can't cook without knowing what's available." She poured him a cup of coffee and set it in front of him without asking. "The last two items on the list are things that need to be thrown out today before they make someone sick. Your foreman should know." He read through the list. It was thorough and accurate. He knew the cold storage situation had been getting worse, but he hadn't dealt with it because dealing with it required attention that he'd been putting toward the property records. "You've run a kitchen before," he said. "I've run several." She was back at the stove checking the oatmeal. "I was a cook and housekeeper for most of my adult life. Before that, I kept house for my husband." "Where's your husband now?" A brief pause. Not painful exactly, more like the pause of someone deciding how much information the question actually warranted. "Dead," she said. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was complicated." She stirred the oatmeal. "Your ranch hands will be up in 20 minutes. How many take their breakfast here?" he told her. She nodded and went about the work of feeding them. Dale found Gideon at the fence line before noon. "The Ashcroft woman," Dale said, pulling his collar up against the wind. "What now?" "She found the rot in the east barn sidewall, the one Henderson kept saying would hold another season." Dale paused meaningfully. "It won't hold another week in this weather. She put rags along the bottom of it to block the draft from reaching the horses, but she says it needs to be patched before the temperature drops further tonight." Gideon looked at him. "She just decided that on her own. She asked me first. Said she didn't want to touch anything on your property without permission, but the horses were her concern since you'd given her use of the barn." Dale's expression was carefully neutral. "She was right about the wall, boss. I looked at it myself. Henderson was wrong." Gideon spent a moment processing the fact that a woman who had arrived at his gate in a snowstorm had correctly identified a structural problem that his experienced foreman had missed. "Get the patch materials," he said. "I'll help." She already told 2 of the boys what to use and how to do it. He stared at Dale. Dale looked somewhere past his left shoulder. She was very specific. By the 3rd day, the storm showed no sign of releasing its grip on the territory, and something had shifted in the atmosphere of the Mercer house that Gideon couldn't entirely name. It wasn't warmth, exactly. The house was physically warmer because someone was maintaining the stoves properly and keeping the firewood rotation organized. But there was something else, a quality to the air that had been absent for long enough that he'd stopped noticing its absence, the way you stop noticing a missing piece of furniture after a few years. The men ate better. They came to meals on time now because the food was worth coming on time for. They talked more around the table, not much, but more than the silence they'd settled into under the previous arrangements. Naomi Ashcroft sat at the far end and usually said very little, but when she did speak, people listened without quite knowing why. Gideon noticed it during supper on the 3rd evening. One of the younger hands, a 19-year-old named Coop, who was opinionated beyond his years, said something dismissive about the western fence dispute, a boundary question that had been simmering between Gideon and his neighbor Aldous Fitch for 3 seasons. "The fence line is settled," Coop said. "Mr. Mercer's had those acres since before any of us were working here. Fitch just needs to accept it." "The fence line isn't settled," Naomi said from the end of the table. Everyone looked at her. "Fitch's original land grant from '71 mentions a creek marker that moved," she said. "I saw the reference in some of the documents Mr. Mercer had in the study. If that marker shifted and it hasn't been resurveyed, the legal boundary might not be where the physical fence is." Silence. "How do you know about the study documents?" Gideon said. "I cleaned the study yesterday morning. I asked your foreman if that was acceptable. The documents were on the desk." She met his eyes. "I didn't read through them deliberately, but when you're cleaning around papers, you see things. You read the land records. Some of them." She held his gaze without apology. "I wasn't snooping, but if what I saw is accurate, you have a problem that's more serious than you know." The table had gone very quiet. Gideon set down his fork. "After supper," he said, "you and I are going to talk about what you saw." They sat at the kitchen table after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done. Naomi had a cup of tea. He had coffee. She laid out what she'd observed in the records with the same clear, practical manner she used for everything. No drama, no flourish, just the facts assembled in order. The creek marker question was real. He knew it was real. He'd known it for 2 years and had been hoping that Fitch would never figure it out. Fitch has a new man working for him, Naomi said. I heard the hands talking this morning. Someone named Voss, Harlan Voss. Do you know him? Something in Gideon's chest went cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. I know him, he said. The hand said he's been spending time in town, asking questions about property records. She watched his face. That's a problem for you, isn't it? It wasn't a question, and he didn't answer it like one. Voss is a land broker, he said. He works for a group out of Denver that's been acquiring land in this territory for 2 years. Whatever he's doing with Fitch is not about a fence line. What's it about? He looked at her for a moment, weighing the question the way he weighed most things, against the cost of answering it honestly. Water, he said. There's a spring on the western acres, the only reliable year-round water source in this section of the territory. If Voss can establish that the land belongs to Fitch rather than me, and then acquire it from Fitch, every ranch in the area loses access to water, or pays whatever price Voss and his people decide to charge. Naomi was quiet for a moment. She turned her teacup in her hands, a gesture he was starting to recognize as the way she bought herself time to think. How long have you known about Voss being in the territory? Since October. And what have you done about it? He didn't answer immediately. Nothing, she said. Not accusing, just reading the silence accurately. You've done nothing. I've been watching. Watching isn't the same as acting. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him with those dark, observant eyes that had a way of landing on exactly the thing he least wanted examined. Why? She asked. You don't seem like a man who freezes. The question sat between them. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it down again. Because acting means working with other people, he said finally. The ranchers in this territory would need to be coordinated. There'd need to be a joint legal challenge. That requires trust and shared planning, and you don't like any of those things. I manage on my own. You manage on your own, she repeated, like she was testing the weight of the phrase. And how is that working out, with Voss 30 miles away building a case that could cost you everything? The question was so direct it almost landed like a slap. Not cruel, just completely unpadded by any of the social cushioning that most people would have wrapped around it. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? I'm not sure. Not this. She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it reached her eyes. People rarely know what to expect from a woman traveling alone in a blizzard. They usually pick something that makes them more comfortable. He opened his mouth to respond, and then stopped, because he couldn't argue with that. The record's in the study, he said. The original's from 71. Would you be able to find the specific passage you mentioned? Yes. Then I'd like you to show me tomorrow morning. She nodded, pushed back from the table. Good night, Mr. Mercer. Gideon, he said, before he'd thought about it. She paused at the doorway and looked back at him. Something moved through her expression, not quite surprise, not quite warmth, something more careful than either. Good night, Gideon, she said. And then she was gone, and he sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the window that showed nothing but black and blowing snow, thinking about water rights and land records and the way a woman could walk into your house in the middle of a blizzard and somehow, without asking your permission, begin to make herself necessary. Well, on the 5th morning, Gideon woke to find that the storm had broken sometime before dawn and left behind a silence so complete it felt physical. He was dressed and out before 5:30, walking the property the way he did after any major weather, checking the animals, the outbuildings, the fence lines he could reach. The world was white and still. His breath came out in solid clouds. He walked the east barn first, and when he opened the door, the warmth hit him immediately. The patched wall holding against the cold the way the old wall hadn't, horses standing easy in the stalls instead of hunched against drafts. He found Naomi in the barn already, working down the first row with a brush, talking quietly to the gray mare. The horse's condition had improved dramatically since that first night. She stood square and solid, watching her handler with relaxed ears. Naomi didn't stop what she was doing when he came in. Storm's done, he said. I heard it quiet down around 3 a.m, she said. I couldn't sleep. You should be able to travel by afternoon if the temperature holds. She kept brushing, The horse shifted slightly and she adjusted with it. Is that your way of telling me to be ready to leave? It's my way of noting that the road to Casper will be passable. She stopped brushing and looked at him over the mare's neck. And the conversation we were going to continue this morning? About the land records? He hadn't forgotten it. He'd been thinking about it since 4 o'clock. That conversation doesn't need you to stay, he said. You could write down what you remember before you go. I could, she said, or I could stay until you've got what you need to act on it. Something about the directness of the offer made him uncomfortable, and discomfort made him careful. I'm not going to pay you, he said. It came out rougher than he meant it. She didn't flinch. I didn't ask you to. Then what are you suggesting? You just stay out of what, civic duty? I'm suggesting, she said, in the tone of someone who had decided patience was going to be necessary here, that I'm not in a hurry. My sister in Casper isn't expecting me on any particular day. I've got nowhere I have to be before spring, and you have a problem that's going to get significantly worse if Voss has been at those records in town. She went back to brushing the mare. But if you'd rather I write it down and leave, I'll do that. He stood in the open barn door for a moment, cold air coming in around him. The cook's quarters are off the kitchen, he said. They're not much, but they're private. She nodded without looking up. That'll do. He turned to go, stopped. Naomi. Yes? Why? He turned back to look at her, the question he'd been sitting with for 4 days and hadn't been able to leave alone. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why does this matter to you? She was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet, the teacup turning pause. Because Voss is the same type as a man I knew once, she said, and I watched that man ruin people because the people who could have stopped him decided it wasn't their problem until it was too late. She met his eyes across the horse's back. I'm not going to watch that happen again if there's something useful I can do about it. He looked at her for a long beat. There was something in her answer that was honest in a way that felt different from how people usually answered questions. Not rounded off at the edges, not made more comfortable for the listener. All right, he said. You can stay. That afternoon, they sat together at the study table with the land records laid out between them, and Naomi walked him through what she'd seen. She was precise and organized. She referred to specific page numbers and document dates. She had a mind that worked in straight lines and made connections quickly. By the time they were done, Gideon understood 3 things that he hadn't fully understood before. The first was that Voss's operation was further along than he'd thought. The timing of the broker's appearance with Fitch, the questions being asked in town, it suggested that a legal filing was coming within weeks, not months. The second was that his instinct to handle it alone was probably going to destroy him. A joint challenge from multiple landowners would have legal weight that a single complaint from a man with Gideon's reputation for stubbornness would not. The third was that the woman sitting across from him, who had arrived at his gate in a blizzard with a tired horse and a patched coat and nothing to prove to anyone, might be the clearest thinker he had encountered in years. He didn't say any of that. He gathered the records into a stack and looked at the window. I need to go into town, he said. Talk to the county clerk, get a look at whatever's been filed recently. I know, she said. I'll leave in the morning. I'll have breakfast ready before you go. He nodded, started to stand up. Gideon? He paused. She had both hands flat on the table, and she was looking at him with an expression that was more direct than comfortable. The ranchers you're going to need to work with, she said. I heard you mention 3 names in passing over the last few days. Brennan, the Hartley brothers, and Okafor. Do you have reasonable relationships with any of them? He thought about it. Brennan and I have history. Some of it's good. Okafor I respect. The Hartleys are manageable. Then start there, she said. Don't try to build a coalition of 12. Build 3 solid relationships that trust each other, and let those relationships grow outward. He looked at her for a moment. Have you organized something like this before? In a different context, she said. And then she looked down at the papers, and the subject was closed, and he didn't push it, because he understood, in some imprecise way he hadn't earned the right to examine yet, that there was a story behind that answer that was not available to him. Not yet. He went to bed that night thinking about water rights and Harlan Voss and the legal filing that was probably already drafted and sitting in someone's desk in Denver. And somewhere in the back of his mind, quieter and more persistent than all of it, he was thinking about the way Naomi Ashcroft had said, I'm not going to watch that happen again, with a certainty that had no performance in it, No drama, no angle. Just the flat, undeniable weight of someone who had already paid the price once for standing still and had decided she was done paying it. He left for town before the sun was fully up, and Naomi watched the black horse disappear down the south road from the kitchen window with a feeling she didn't immediately name. It wasn't worry. She'd stopped worrying about men who hadn't asked for it a long time ago. It was something closer to attention, the particular alertness she'd learned to carry when the situation around her was moving faster than it appeared to be, and the people involved hadn't noticed yet. She turned back to the kitchen and started on the morning work. The hands came in for breakfast in the usual order, Dale first, then the older men, then Coop, and the two youngest trailing in with their boots only half-laced and their hair going in 3 directions. She'd been feeding them for 5 days now, and she knew their patterns the way she always learned people's patterns, quickly and without much effort, the way you learn a kitchen's particular quirks in the first hour of working it. Dale sat at his usual end of the table and didn't say much until he had coffee in front of him. "Boss get off all right?" he asked. "Left at first light," Naomi said. "He took the black horse. I checked the gray's left front shoe before you put her to work today. She was favoring it slightly this morning." Dale looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen on him several times already. Not quite suspicion, not quite respect, something working its way between the two. "You notice a lot of things," he said. "It's a habit," she said, and went back to the stove. Coop, halfway through his second biscuit, said without any particular tact, "How long are you staying?" The table went a little quiet. "Until I'm not useful anymore," Naomi said. Coop seemed to find this answer acceptable. He went back to his biscuit. Dale looked at the surface of his coffee like it was telling him something. Gideon returned from town in the late afternoon, and he came back different. Not dramatically different, not in a way that anyone who didn't pay attention would have caught. But Naomi was at the kitchen table working through a list of supply orders she'd drafted when she heard his horse come into the yard, and when he came through the door, she could see it immediately. The controlled flatness of his expression that was doing too much work, the way a man's face looks when he's keeping something from showing. He hung up his coat and hat. He looked at the supply list on the table, then at her. "It's bad," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. For a moment he just put both hands flat on the table and stared at them. "Voss filed a preliminary boundary claim 3 weeks ago," he said. "I didn't know because the county clerk, the man who should have notified me, is Fitch's wife's second cousin." Naomi was quiet. The claim argues that the 71 Grants Creek marker places the actual boundary line 40 yards east of the current fence, which puts the spring entirely on Fitch's side. He looked up. "And Fitch signed over option rights to a Denver land company 6 days ago, a company called Western Territorial Holdings." "Voss's people," she said. "Voss's people." He leaned back in his chair. "If the boundary claim holds, the spring doesn't belong to me. If the spring doesn't belong to me, it belongs to Western Territorial Holdings within 60 days of the claim being validated, and they will charge every ranch in this territory for water access, every single one." He paused. "Or they'll refuse it entirely and force people to sell." The fire in the stove popped. Outside, the wind had picked up again. Not a storm, just the ordinary Wyoming wind that never entirely went away. "What do you need to challenge it?" Naomi asked. "A surveyor who's not in Voss's pocket, a lawyer who's better than the one Western Territorial has, and—" he stopped. "And what?" "Testimony from the other landowners, about historical water use, about how long they've had access to the spring and what they've relied on it for." He said it like each word cost something. "A joint challenge." "Which means asking for help," she said. He didn't answer. "Gideon." She said his name with enough weight that he looked at her. "I know what it costs you to say that, but you have to say it anyway, because the alternative is losing everything. I've managed this ranch alone for 9 years. You managed it alone when the threat was manageable alone," she said. "This isn't that." He looked at the table. His jaw moved once, the way it did when he was working through something that didn't fit neatly. "If I go to Brennan and Okafor and the Hartleys and ask for their help," he said, "I'm telling them that I can't handle this by myself. And once they know that, they know you're human," she said, "which they already suspected, since you are, in fact, human." He looked at her sharply. She held his gaze without backing down. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm telling you that the story you're telling yourself about what asking for help means isn't accurate. Brennan is facing the same threat. Okafor's spring-fed land runs right up against the boundary in question. They have as much reason to fight this as you do. You're not asking them for a favor. You're offering them a coalition. He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen settled around them. The fire, the wind, the distant sound of the hands moving around the bunkhouse. I'll need to go see Brennan, he said finally, in person. Tomorrow? Day after. I need to pull together the documentation first. He looked at the table again. I don't know if Brennan will listen. Does he respect you? As much as I've given him reason to. Then go give him more reason, she said. Holtz. The next day, Gideon stayed in the study until past dark, going through land records, deed copies, and a stack of correspondence he'd been avoiding for 3 months. Naomi brought him dinner on a plate at 7 o'clock rather than calling him to the table, because she'd learned by now that pulling him out of a problem mid-thought was the fastest way to make him lose the threat of it. He looked up when she set the plate down, and something flickered in his face. A brief, involuntary thing, like surprise that someone had thought of it. You didn't have to. I was in the kitchen anyway, she said. The coffee on the left burner is fresh. She turned to go. Naomi. She stopped in the doorway. Sit down for a minute. It wasn't a command. It came out more uncertain than that, like a question wearing the shape of a statement. She turned back around and sat in the chair across from his desk. He put down his pen. Tell me about the man you mentioned, he said. The one Voss reminded you of. She looked at him carefully. That's not a small question. I know. She thought about it for a moment, about whether she wanted to open that particular door in this particular room, with this particular man looking at her with that particular expression, which was the most genuinely curious she'd seen him, and therefore the most unguarded. His name was Franklin, she said. He owned a mining operation in Colorado. When I met him, he was charming and certain about everything, the way those men always are. She folded her hands in her lap. He wasn't cruel exactly. He was just consuming. He took up all the space in any room he was in and in any life he touched, including mine. You worked for him? I married him, she said. He went still. I spent 8 years trying to make things work that weren't going to work. And the whole time, I watched him make promises to people he never intended to keep. Land deals, water rights, supply contracts. He'd sign agreements and then find legal angles to dissolve them when they stopped being convenient. She paused. Voss operates the same way. Different scale, same method. What happened to Franklin? He died of a fever 4 winters ago. She said it with the same tone she used for most facts. Not cold, just accurate. The operation collapsed 6 months later because he'd built it on paper and promises and there was nothing solid underneath. A lot of people lost a lot of things they'd trusted him with. And you? I had very little left by the time he died. I'd gradually stopped being a person with my own opinions and became mostly an extension of his operation. She said it without drama, the way someone describes a long illness they've recovered from. After he was gone, I had to remember how to think for myself again. It took a while. The fire in the hearth made a sound. He was watching her with an attention that was hard to look at directly. That's why you travel alone, he said. Partly. She looked at her hands. And partly because I'm still not sure I trust my own judgment about men well enough to attach my life to one again. The room was quiet for a moment. That's honest, he said. I found it saves time. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but a movement in that direction that stopped before it arrived. I was engaged once, he said. 14 years ago. She looked at him. He hadn't offered information before. Not freely, not like this. She left, he said. 3 weeks before the wedding. Went back east with a man who had more money and softer hands and a house that didn't require 14 hands to run. He picked up his pen again, turned it over. She sent a letter, very polite, explained that she had made a mistake, that Wyoming was not what she'd imagined, that she hoped I'd understand. Did you? No. He set the pen down. But I got used to it eventually. What I didn't get used to was the 2 years before that. The way everyone in the territory treated her appearance as proof that I'd finally figured out how to be a normal person. And then when she left, the way they... He stopped. The way they pitied you, she said. The way they looked at me, he said. Like my solitude had been confirmed as my natural state and they'd just been waiting for the evidence. She understood that. The particular cruelty of having your worst fear about yourself confirmed publicly. So you stopped letting people get close enough to leave, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I stopped letting people get close enough to do much of anything. That's not the same as being strong, she said. Not harshly, just accurately. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was harder to read than his usual expressions. Layered, complicated, aware of itself. No, he said. I know that. She stood up. Eat your dinner before it's cold. The documentation can wait an hour. He almost argued. She could see it in the set of his jaw. Then he picked up his fork. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the dark yard, aware of something she hadn't felt in a long while. The specific discomfort of finding a person more interesting than you'd budgeted for. Tab. Gideon rode out to Brennan's place 2 days later, and he came back that same evening, which Naomi hadn't expected. She was in the barn doing the last of the evening feeding when she heard hoofbeats in the yard. She came out to find him dismounting in the gray dark, his coat white-dusted from the road. That was fast, she said. Brennan already knew, Gideon said. She took the horse's reins. About the filing? About all of it. He found out the same day I did, through a different channel. He's been sitting on it, trying to figure out what to do. He pulled his gloves off, finger by finger. He's angry, and he's scared, which means he's angrier than he's showing. Did he agree to work with you? Gideon was quiet for just a beat too long. He agreed to a meeting, he said. All of us. Brennan, the Hartleys, Okafor. Here, if I'm willing to host it. That's more than a meeting, she said. If he's bringing the Hartleys and Okafor, he's already talked to them. Gideon looked at her. I know. Which means Brennan's been trying to organize this himself and didn't know how to approach you. A pause. Apparently. She handed the horse to the young hand who'd appeared at the barn door. Then she looked back at Gideon. When? End of the week, Friday evening. How many people total? He counted. 12, maybe 15, including the foreman. I'll need to know by Thursday afternoon how many are staying overnight, she said, already calculating. The kitchen can handle supper for 15, but I'll need Dale to bring up supplies from the cold storage. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen a few times, the one that meant he'd been expecting resistance or complication and found neither. You'll need to be in that meeting, he said. Why? Because you've read the land records more carefully than anyone else here, including me, and because... He stopped, seemed to make a decision. Because you see things I miss. I'd rather have you in the room. She stood in the yard in the cold, looking at him. The wind moved her coat. He was watching her with that careful, unguarded attention he sometimes forgot to guard against. All right, she said, I'll be in the room. Well, the days between that conversation and Friday had their own particular texture. The work of the ranch continued. It always did, weather or legal crisis or any other interruption, because animals don't wait for human problems to resolve themselves. Naomi moved through it the way she'd moved through the whole 2 weeks. Up before anyone else, work until there was nothing left to do, sleep, repeat. But something was different now, and she was honest enough with herself to admit it. She'd started paying attention to Gideon Mercer the way she hadn't let herself pay attention to anyone in 3 years. Not in a romantic way, or not only in that way. More in the way she paid attention to problems worth solving. The particular quality of his thinking. The gap between how he presented himself, closed off, sufficient, self-contained, and the man who'd brought dinner to his study table not as a transaction, but as a habit slowly establishing itself. She noticed when he started leaving the study door open. It was a small thing. He'd always kept it closed before, not locked, just shut, the physical equivalent of the expression he wore in company. But by the second week, she'd walk past at mid-morning and the door would be open 3 inches, then 6. By Thursday, it was open wide enough that she could see his desk from the hallway, and he never looked up when she passed, but she had the distinct sense that the open door was not an accident. She didn't mention it. Some things communicated themselves more accurately by not being named. Thursday evening, Dale found her in the root cellar doing a final inventory count. "Can I ask you something?" he said, ducking under the low frame. "You're going to regardless," she said, without heat. He almost smiled. "Fair enough. He stood there for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "What are you doing here? And I don't mean in the cellar." She kept counting. "I'm doing a job." "You're not getting paid for it." "No." "You could have left when the storm cleared. You stayed." She wrote a number on her paper. "I stayed because there's work to be done, and I can do it. That's the whole explanation, Dale." He was quiet for a moment. "He's different," he said, "since you came. Not, I don't mean anything inappropriate by that. I just mean he's different. He leaves the study door open." She looked at Dale then and found an older man with honest eyes and a face that had spent too many years in the Wyoming wind. A man who cared about his employer the way people sometimes care about difficult things they've chosen to stick with. "I know," she said. "He's going to get hurt if you leave without warning," Dale said. Not accusingly, just factually. She considered that for a moment. The weight of it. The responsibility in it. The particular unfairness of having that said to her when she hadn't done anything deliberately. "I'm aware," she said finally. "That's all," Dale said. "Just wanted you to know that someone noticed." He put his hat back on and left, and Naomi stood in the root cellar for a long moment before she finished her inventory. Friday came with a cold sky and no wind, which in Wyoming passed for pleasant. The ranchers arrived in the afternoon, Brennan first, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with a white beard and the handshake of someone who'd spent his life making his grip count. Then the Hartley brothers, Tom and James, who were nothing alike and seemed to disagree on principle about most things but fell entirely silent and aligned when something mattered. Then Samuel Okafor, who'd come to Wyoming from Georgia 12 years ago and built a cattle operation from scratch, and had a quietness about him that Naomi recognized as the particular stillness of someone who has learned which battles are worth noise. She fed them all. She kept coffee hot and didn't hover. And when the conversation in the main room got loud, which happened within the first 20 minutes, because Brennan had strong opinions and Tom Hartley had stronger ones, she let it be loud and didn't flinch. Gideon had set up the meeting at the long table in the main room. He sat at the head, and he had the documentation spread out in front of him, and Naomi sat 2 seats down with a pen and paper, and nobody questioned it because Gideon hadn't introduced her as a guest or a housekeeper, but simply as someone whose observations were going to be useful. The meeting was hard. Brennan thought they should file immediately and worry about coordination later. Tom Hartley thought they should wait and see if Western Territorial's claim would even hold. James Hartley disagreed with his brother, loudly. Okafor said very little for the first 40 minutes, and then said something so precise and devastating about the legal weakness in the boundary claim that everyone stopped arguing and listened. Gideon managed the room better than Naomi had expected, not by dominating it, but by knowing when to push and when to let people talk themselves into the corner they were going to end up in anyway. Halfway through, Brennan looked at the papers in front of Naomi and said, "Who prepared that summary?" "I did," Naomi said. Brennan looked at Gideon. "Who is she exactly?" "She's the person who found the creek marker reference in the original survey documents," Gideon said. "Before I did. So I'd suggest taking the summary seriously." Brennan looked at the summary again, then at Naomi. He had the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You read land grants for fun?" he said. "I read everything," she said. "It's a habit." Something in his face shifted towards something she recognized as reluctant approval. He turned back to the table. After 3 hours, they had the outline of a plan. Joint filing with a territorial court. Shared costs for a proper survey. 3 depositions from longtime residents who'd used the spring going back to the territory's early settlement. Okafor knew a lawyer in Cheyenne who'd successfully challenged a Western Territorial filing 2 years prior. It wasn't settled. There were still pieces that could fall apart. But there was the shape of a real fight now, which was different from the formless dread of 2 weeks ago. When the ranchers filed out, 2 staying overnight in the spare rooms, the others heading for the Brennan place, Gideon stood at the front door and shook each hand, and Naomi watched him do it with the observation she'd been keeping careful watch on since that first evening in the kitchen. He didn't enjoy it. He found it effortful and slightly uncomfortable. She could see that in the way his shoulders carried tension that didn't drop until the last man was gone. But he did it anyway, and he did it well, because he understood by now that the ranch needed it and the situation required it, and his own preferences were a smaller consideration than the outcome. That was not nothing. She was washing the last of the cups when he came into the kitchen. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. He sat down at the table. He looked tired, not physically, but in the particular way of someone who's been managing their presentation for several hours and has finally stopped. "Brennan likes you," he said. "Brennan tolerated me, which at this stage is effectively the same thing." He almost smiled. "Okafor asked me afterward who had trained you in land law." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you were self-taught and he should probably not underestimate you on that basis." He paused. "He said he wouldn't." She dried the last cup and set it on the shelf, turned around and leaned against the counter, looking at him. "You did something hard today," she said, "asking them for help." He looked at the table. "It's not... I didn't ask. I offered a coalition." "Gideon." He looked up. "You asked for help," she said quietly. "And that was the right thing to do. You don't have to call it something else." A long beat of silence. The kitchen was warm. The fire was low and would need banking before bed. "I know," he said, and then after a moment, "Thank you." She nodded, straightened up. "Bank the kitchen fire before you sleep," she said, "and drink some water. You had nothing but coffee since noon." She left the kitchen before she could let herself linger in the particular warmth of the look he gave her when she said it. Not grateful exactly, and not affectionate exactly, but something that sat in the space between those two things and didn't have a simpler name. She went to the cook's quarters and sat on the edge of her narrow bed and thought about Dale's words in the root cellar. "He's going to get hurt if you leave without warning." She thought about the open study door, the dinner plate she'd brought without asking, the way he'd said her name in the barn the night he came back from Brennan's, not as a summons, but as though the word itself was something he'd been careful with. She thought about what it meant to let yourself matter to someone when you were still not entirely sure you could be trusted with it. Outside, the Wyoming night was very cold and very clear, and somewhere out there, Harlan Voss was sitting in a warm office somewhere making plans that he believed were already decided. He was wrong about that. But the reckoning for that particular heir was still some weeks away, and there was still plenty of road between here and it, and Naomi Ashcroft had learned, at considerable cost, that the only way through difficult terrain was one careful step at a time. The joint filing went to the territorial court on a Wednesday morning in early December, and by Thursday afternoon, Harlan Voss knew about it. Gideon found out that Voss knew because Fitch's youngest ranch hand, a boy of 17 who had no loyalty to anyone and a weakness for loose talk in the general store, mentioned to the feed clerk that Voss had been at Fitch's place until past midnight and had left in a state that the boy described as the kind of angry that breaks furniture. Dale brought this information to Gideon at breakfast. Gideon relayed it to Naomi. Naomi said, "Good," and went back to the stove. Coop looked at her from across the table. "Good that he's angry?" "Angry men make mistakes," she said. "Calm men with unlimited resources are harder to fight. Give me angry." The table was quiet for a moment. Then Dale said, "She's not wrong," and poured himself more coffee. The weeks that followed had a particular rhythm to them. Not comfortable exactly, but purposeful, which was its own kind of steadiness. Gideon rode out 3 days a week to meet with Brennan, the Hartleys, or Okafor, building the case document by document, conversation by conversation. The Cheyenne lawyer Okafor had recommended, a man named Theodore Marsh, who was small and precise and had a reputation for being profoundly unimpressed by wealthy opponents, came to the ranch twice and sat at the long table in the main room with a stack of papers and asked questions that were so specific and so well aimed that even Gideon visibly recalibrated his estimate of the man. Naomi sat in on both meetings, not conspicuously. She was in the room, she listened, and when Marsh asked about the creek marker documentation the second time, she answered him with a precision that made him look up from his notes and regard her with the particular attention of someone who has discovered that the quiet person in the corner is the one actually worth talking to. "You have a copy of the original 71 survey?" Marsh asked. "Working copy," she said. "The original is in the county records. But there's a discrepancy between the survey and the map that was filed with it. The map shows the creek marker 12 yards further west than the survey text describes, which is either a drafting error or a deliberate misrepresentation, and either way it weakens Western Territorial's argument." Marsh looked at Gideon. "Where did you find her?" "She found me," Gideon said. "She arrived in a blizzard." Marsh looked back at Naomi. "I'd like you to write up what you just described. 2 pages, plain language, as if you were explaining it to someone who's never read a land survey in their life. I can do that, she said. She had it on his desk, via Gideon's courier, within 48 hours. The problem with purposeful rhythms is that they can blind you to what's moving underneath them. Naomi saw it first, the way she usually saw things first. Not because she was smarter than the men around her, but because she wasn't in the middle of it. She could stand slightly to the side and see the shape of things that the people inside couldn't. What she saw was this. Gideon was changing, and he didn't know it yet, and the change was not entirely comfortable for him. It was small things. The study door, still open. The way he'd started lingering at the kitchen table after the hands left in the morning, not dramatically, just 5 or 10 minutes longer than before, with his coffee and his thoughts. And if she happened to be working nearby, they would talk. Not always about the case. Sometimes about nothing in particular. A fence problem in the north pasture, a horse with a sore leg, a book she'd mentioned that he'd pulled off the shelf and read 3 chapters of. He asked her opinion about things he hadn't asked anyone's opinion about in years. She knew this not because he told her, but because she could see the unfamiliarity of the gesture in the slight awkwardness with which he made it, like someone using a muscle they'd let go stiff. She was careful. She was more careful, in fact, than she would have liked to be. Because the part of her that was not careful, the part that had gotten quieter over 3 years of solitary travel but hadn't disappeared, found Gideon Mercer considerably more interesting than she'd planned on, and that part had to be managed. She did not want to become essential to him and then discover she'd made a mistake. She did not want to repeat the long, gradual erasure of herself inside someone else's life. But she also couldn't pretend that the distinction between those fears and the present reality was as clear as she needed it to be. Because Gideon wasn't Franklin, she knew that. The differences were fundamental and structural and visible in everything from the way he managed his hands to the way he listened when someone spoke to him. The trouble was that being not Franklin wasn't, by itself, enough. She'd learned that the hard way. So she was careful. She stayed useful, and she stayed honest, and she did not let herself move faster than the ground would hold. It was the 3rd week of December when Voss made his first direct move. Not legal. Not yet. What he did was send a man to each of the 4 ranches involved in the coalition, a smooth-talking representative from Western Territorial, who arrived with a leather satchel and a printed offer sheet, and proposed individual settlements. The offer was different at each ranch, crafted specifically for each landowner's known financial pressures. Gideon's offer included a substantial payment and a written guarantee of water access for his property only, at a fixed rate for 10 years. It was a good offer, as these things went. It was designed to be good enough to tempt, and specific enough to feel personal. Gideon read it at the kitchen table that evening and pushed it across to Naomi without comment. She read it carefully, then she set it down. They sent different offers to all 4 of you, she said. Yes. Designed to make each of you think you could get out individually without losing much. Yes. If even one of you takes it, the coalition fractures. That's the point, he said. She looked at the offer sheet again. The water access guarantee is only for your property, not your heirs, not transferable. And the rate is fixed now, but has an escalation clause buried in paragraph 7 that kicks in after year 5. He leaned forward. Show me. She pointed to the paragraph. He read it. His expression did a particular thing she'd seen it do before when he encountered something that confirmed his worst estimate of a person's character. Not surprise, exactly. More like a grim satisfaction at being right. Voss drafted this himself, he said. Nobody on his staff would have thought to bury it there. He's done this before, she said. This is not his first coalition. He's had practice breaking them. Gideon pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment. I need to get word to Brennan tonight, he said, before his people talk him into considering it. Tom Hartley is the weak point, Naomi said. He's been carrying debt on the south pasture since the drought year. A personal offer with enough immediate cash. I know, Gideon said. I've known for 2 weeks. He turned around. I didn't want to push him. I didn't want him to feel like I was watching him for signs of defection. You have to go talk to him, tonight, not tomorrow. And you have to do it without making him feel cornered. He looked at her. How do I do that? She thought about it. You go and you tell him you got an offer and you're not taking it, and you wanted him to know that first, before he heard it from anyone else. You're not asking him anything. You're just telling him where you stand. He was quiet for a moment. He stopped. What? That's not how I usually handle things, he said. I know, she said. Try it anyway. He rode out an hour later. He came back before midnight, and when he came into the kitchen, she was still up. Not waiting for him, she told herself, just unable to sleep. And he stood in the doorway with his coat still on and said, Tom's holding. She let out a breath. Good. He was close, Gideon said. He admitted it. He said the money would have cleared the South Pasture debt and had him square for the first time in 4 years. He paused. He also said, he stopped. What? He said nobody had ever come to tell him where they stood before asking what he was going to do. He looked at the floor for a moment, the way he did when something had landed in a place he hadn't expected. He said it made a difference. Naomi didn't say anything. She turned and poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table, and he sat down and they sat together in the quiet kitchen while the fire burned low, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. Christmas came and went without ceremony. There was no family to speak of on the Mercer Ranch. Gideon's parents were long dead. He had a sister in Oregon he exchanged letters with twice a year, and the Hands mostly had their own arrangements. Naomi had written to her sister in Casper weeks ago to explain that her arrival would be delayed, and her sister had written back a letter that was short and sensible and said simply that she'd be there when she got there. On Christmas morning, Naomi made a proper breakfast, eggs and smoked ham and biscuits with preserved plum jam she'd found in the back of the pantry, and the Hands ate it like men who hadn't expected kindness and weren't entirely sure what to do with it now that it had arrived. Gideon gave her something that morning that she didn't expect. Not a gift exactly. He came into the kitchen while she was cleaning up and set a small, folded piece of paper on the counter beside her without saying anything. She opened it later, when she was alone. It was a note, written in his careful hand. I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound like something it isn't, so I'll just say it plainly. This house is better with you in it. Not because of the cooking, though the cooking is good. Because of the rest of it. Thank you. She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, and she didn't mention it and neither did he. And somehow, that was exactly right. January arrived with the second storm, smaller than the November one but bitter, and with it came news that changed the shape of the fight entirely. Marsh sent a message from Cheyenne. Western Territorial had filed an accelerated motion to have the boundary claim validated before the joint counterfiling could be fully processed. They were trying to move faster than the coalition could keep up. If the motion was approved, the boundary would be legally confirmed within 30 days, and the counter-challenge would have to fight uphill from a position of established fact rather than disputed claim. Gideon read the message at breakfast, and the kitchen went quiet. Can Marsh block the motion? Dale asked. He's trying, Gideon said, but he needs more. He needs something that directly challenges the validity of the original filing. He set the message down. The 71 survey discrepancy isn't enough on its own. It raises doubt, but it doesn't disprove. Naomi was at the stove, and she hadn't moved for a moment. The original survey party, she said. Gideon looked at her. What about it? Who conducted it? She turned around. The original 71 survey. Who was the surveyor of record? He thought. A man named Elias Cutter, territory appointed. Is he still alive? Cutter? Gideon looked uncertain. He'd be in his 70s. I haven't thought about Cutter in years. If he's alive and you can find him, she said, and if the discrepancy between the survey text and the filed map was a drafting error or a correction that was improperly processed, he might remember it. Surveyors remember their work, especially if they knew at the time that something wasn't right. The table was very quiet. That's a long chain of ifs, Dale said. Yes, Naomi agreed. But if even one of those ifs is true, and Cutter can testify that the filed map doesn't reflect his actual survey, then Western Territorial's whole boundary argument collapses. Because the boundary they're claiming was drawn by a map, not a survey. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the one that meant he was running it forward in his mind, checking it for flaws. Cutter was from Laramie, he said slowly. He had family there. If he retired, start with the Territorial Surveyor's Office, she said. They'd have records of all their appointed surveyors, addresses, if they're living. He looked at Dale. Dale was already standing up. I'll ride to town and send a wire, Dale said. Today. The response came back in 4 days. Elias Cutter was alive, 73 years old, living in Laramie with a daughter. He had retired from surveying in 1878 and, according to the Territorial Office's note, was in reasonable health and had never, to their knowledge, been contacted regarding the 1871 boundary surveys. Gideon read the telegram at the kitchen table and then looked at Naomi across it. "I have to go to Laramie," he said. "Yes. That's 3 days' ride." "I know." He folded the telegram. "The ranch. We'll be fine," she said. "Dale knows how to run it, and I'll be here." He looked at her. Something passed through his face, not hesitation, but the particular quality of a man checking himself against a feeling he isn't entirely sure he should act on. "I'll leave tomorrow morning," he said. She nodded. "I'll have food packed for the road." He stood up from the table, started to go, then stopped at the doorway. "The note," he said, without turning around. "At Christmas." "Yes?" she said carefully. "I meant what it said." He paused. "I wanted to make sure you knew I meant it. Not as—" He stopped, seemed to decide something. "Not as an employer or a neighbor, just as—" He stopped again. She waited. "Just as myself," he said, "for whatever that's worth." Then he walked out of the kitchen before she could answer, which was probably wise, because she needed a moment before she could have said anything that was both honest and measured, and the distance between those two things had been getting smaller lately in ways she was still taking stock of. I was gone for 8 days. Not 3, 8. Because Elias Cutter was alive and coherent and remembered the 1871 survey. The way old men remember the most consequential things they've ever done, with the kind of precise detail that only comes from something that left a mark. Gideon sent a message on the 5th day, a short telegram that said only, "Cutter remembers." The map was altered after he submitted it. He'll testify. Coming back Friday. Naomi read the telegram in the kitchen and then sat down because her knees felt briefly uncertain. Dale read it over her shoulder and said, "Lord Almighty." "Yes," she said, that's the whole case. If he testifies, it changes everything," she said. She got up and started dinner because there was nothing else to do with the particular electric feeling of having an impossible thing suddenly become possible. And cooking was the way she'd always metabolized strong emotion, with her hands moving and her mind working through the next practical step, rather than the feeling itself. While she was working, she thought about Voss reading Marsh's amended filing, about the moment he realized that Elias Cutter was still alive and had been found and was going to walk into a territorial courtroom and say that the map that was the foundation of his entire legal strategy had been altered after the survey was submitted. She thought about what kind of anger that would produce in a man like Voss. The furniture-breaking kind, probably. And then something colder and more deliberate once the anger had worked itself through. She told Dale that evening to make sure the hands were staying alert, that Voss was going to push harder now, not softer. Dale looked at her. "You think he'd try something outside the courts?" "I think men like Voss keep multiple strategies running at the same time," she said. "The legal route is the main one, but it's not the only one. And now that the main one is in trouble, he'll lean on the others harder," Dale said. "Make sure nobody's riding out alone in the north section," she said, "especially near the spring." Dale went quiet for a moment. "Should I tell the boss?" "When he gets back," she said. "Don't send it in a telegram. I don't know who reads those before they're delivered." Gideon came back on Friday evening, cold and trail-worn and with 3 days' worth of beard on his jaw. And the look on his face when he walked through the door was different from any she'd seen before. Not the controlled flatness he usually carried, but something open underneath it. The look of a man who has done something he didn't think he could do and is still processing what that means. She had dinner ready. He sat down and ate without ceremony, and she sat across from him and waited. Cutter was... He shook his head. "He's an old man, sharp. He knew exactly what happened, said he suspected something was wrong when the final map was published because the creek marker position didn't match his field notes, but he'd already retired by then, and he assumed it was a drafting correction that the territory had authorized." He looked up. "He still has his original field notes." Naomi went very still. "The original field notes. From 1871, his personal copies. He kept everything." Gideon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded paper. Marsh has the originals now. Cutter handed them over voluntarily. Marsh says... He paused, and something crossed his face that was almost disbelief. Marsh says if Cutter testifies and presents the field notes, Western Territorial's boundary claim doesn't just prosecute her for investigation. Because altering a filed survey document is fraud, Naomi said. Criminal fraud, Gideon said, against the territory. They looked at each other across the table. Voss, she said. Or whoever did it on his behalf, Gideon said. Marsh doesn't think Voss got his hands dirty directly, but the company that held the original land contract in '71, he set the paper down. It's a predecessor company to Western Territorial. Same investors, different name. So the fraud runs directly to his organization. Directly. Naomi put both hands flat on the table. Took a breath. He's going to find out you found Cutter, she said. If he doesn't already know. I know. Dale noticed some activity near the north section while you were gone, near the spring. Gideon's expression changed immediately, the openness replaced by something sharper. What kind of activity? Tracks. 2 horses, staying in the tree line, not coming close enough to be confrontational, but close enough to be visible. She met his eyes. Someone wanting us to know they were watching. Voss, he said. Not a question. Intimidation, she said. Not action yet. He still thinks the legal route might work, but he's letting us know he has other options. Gideon was quiet for a moment. She could see him thinking, the particular stillness that meant he was working through something with the part of his mind that operated on instinct rather than deliberation. I need to talk to Marsh, he said. Tomorrow. And I need to talk to Okafor. His north fence line runs closest to the spring. If Voss decides to get physical with the intimidation, Okafor's already aware, she said. He sent a message while you were gone. He's had 2 extra men on that fence line for a week. He looked at her. How did he know to... Because I sent him a note, she said. I told Dale to have it delivered. A pause. You sent word to my neighbors, he said. In your absence, with a situation developing that couldn't wait, she said, meeting his gaze directly. I can explain my reasoning if you want to tell me I overstepped. He looked at her for a long moment. You didn't overstep, he said. I know, she said, but I wanted to give you the option of saying so. Something happened in his face then, something that was almost a laugh but didn't quite arrive there, passing instead into a warmth that settled around his eyes and stayed. You're impossible, he said. Not unkindly, with the specific tone of someone who has found the impossible thing more valuable than they anticipated. I've been told, she said. The coalition meeting 3 days later was larger than the first one. Marsh attended in person this time, making the journey from Cheyenne on a horse that looked like it had opinions about the trip. He brought 2 assistants and a copy of Cutter's field notes and laid everything out on the long table with the methodical efficiency of a man who has been waiting for exactly this kind of ammunition. The mood in the room was different from December, more confident, but also more tense. Because the difference between having a strong case and winning was still significant, and everyone in the room understood that Voss was not going to accept the situation quietly. Tom Hartley said what everyone was thinking about 20 minutes in. Voss isn't just going to sit in Denver and let Marsh file documents, Tom said. He's going to push back. Hard. What happens if that pushing gets physical? The room went quiet. Gideon said, he comes after anyone in this coalition. He's not dealing with one ranch. He's dealing with all of us. Is that a plan or a feeling? Brennan asked. It was a fair question. Naomi had been sitting at the end of the table and she'd been quiet for most of the meeting, but she spoke then. It needs to be a plan, she said. Coordinated response. If anyone reports unusual activity on their property, riders near boundary lines, any kind of physical interference, everyone else is notified within 24 hours and you move people to support. She looked around the table. Voss is betting that you'll break under pressure the way individual ranchers always have. You need to make it structurally impossible to pick you off one at a time. Brennan looked at her. You've done this before. In a different context, she said, which was the same answer she'd given Gideon months ago. But Brennan, unlike Gideon, pushed. What context? He asked. She looked at him steadily. My husband ran a mining operation. He had competitors who used tactics similar to Voss's. I learned what worked and what didn't. The table was quiet for a moment. Your husband's operation, Brennan said carefully. Did it hold? No, she said, but that's because I wasn't running it. She said it without heat, without drama, just the flat fact of it. I'm running this. The silence that followed had a specific quality, the quality of a room full of men recalibrating something they hadn't realized needed recalibrating. Gideon was looking at her from his end of the table with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not surprise, not even pride, exactly. Something quieter than either. The look of a man watching someone stand fully upright and recognizing the sight of it. The meeting ended with a real plan, not a feeling, not a hope, but an actual coordinated structure with assigned responsibilities and communication protocols. Marsh had his documents. Cutter had agreed to travel to the territorial court in February. The boundary challenge would be heard before the accelerated motion could be processed. It was not over. Voss was still out there with resources and connections and the particular cold determination of a man who had never accepted losing. The weeks ahead were going to be hard and uncertain, and they all knew it. But as the ranchers filed out into the January evening, shaking hands, talking in low voices, moving with the particular posture of people who have stopped feeling alone in a problem, Naomi stood at the edge of the yard and watched them go. Gideon came to stand beside her, not close, just beside. You told Brennan you were running this, he said. I did. Were you worried I'd object to that? She thought about it honestly. A little, yes. Don't be, he said. He was quiet for a moment. I've been running things alone for so long that I forgot what it was like to run something with someone. He paused. I think I forgot that it was possible. The cold air sat between them. Somewhere in the dark, a horse stamped and shifted. It's possible, she said. He looked at her. And she looked back. And for a moment neither of them said anything, because the thing that needed saying was not quite ready to be said yet, and they were both, in their different ways, careful people who had learned the cost of moving faster than the ground would hold. But the ground was getting firmer. Both of them felt it, and both of them knew the other felt it, and that knowledge, unspoken, careful, honest, was its own kind of progress. Then Dale appeared at the barn door and called out something about a horse that needed attention, and the moment dispersed the way moments do, into the ordinary work of an ordinary evening on a Wyoming ranch in January, with a fight still ahead and a long winter still to get through. The last 2 weeks of January moved the way. Difficult things always move when you're inside them, slowly, while you're living them, and then all at once when you look back. Marsh filed the amended counter-challenge on a Thursday. By Saturday, word had come back from Cheyenne that the territorial judge had agreed to review the Cutter evidence before ruling on Western Territorial's accelerated motion, which meant, in plain language, that Voss's attempt to rush the boundary validation through before the coalition could respond had been stopped. Temporarily, not permanently, but stopped. Gideon got the news from a rider at noon and came straight to the kitchen where Naomi was working through the week's accounts. Marsh held the motion, he said. She set down her pen. For how long? 60 days. The review hearing is set for the 3rd week of March. She thought through what that meant. Voss has 60 days to discredit Cutter or find something that undermines the field notes. Or to break the coalition, Gideon said. Or that. She picked up her pen again. Then we'd better make sure neither of those things happens. He looked at her for a moment, that particular look she'd gotten used to, the one that meant he was deciding whether to say the thing he was actually thinking. I have to go to Cheyenne, he said. Work with Marsh directly on the Cutter preparation. The opposition is going to try to discredit him, his age, his memory, any inconsistencies they can manufacture. Marsh needs me there to review the case strategy. He paused. It'll be 2 weeks, maybe 3. She absorbed this. When? Monday. She nodded. I'll manage the ranch. I know you will. He said it without qualification, without the brief hesitation that would have been there 2 months ago. Dale knows the operational side, but the coalition, if anything comes up with Brennan or the Hartleys while I'm gone, I'll handle it, she said. I'm not asking you to. Gideon. She looked up at him. I'll handle it. Go to Cheyenne. He held her gaze for a moment. Something in it that was more than gratitude and not quite the thing that lived past gratitude. Or maybe it was exactly that, and they were both still not quite saying so. All right, he said. The 2 weeks he was gone were not quiet. Voss moved within 4 days of Gideon's departure, which told Naomi he'd had someone watching the ranch, watching for exactly this opportunity. The move wasn't physical, it was financial and social, which was in some ways worse because those kinds of attacks were harder to show people and harder to defend against cleanly. What Voss did was this. He contacted the bank in town that held the mortgage on the Hartley brothers' south pasture. Not to call the loan, that would have been too direct, too visible. Instead, he arranged through a third party to purchase a significant portion of the bank's operating debt, which gave Western Territorial's associated investors a quiet seat at the table of that institution. Then he had a representative visit the bank's manager with a suggestion, not a demand, a suggestion, that the Hartley loan terms might benefit from review, given the current uncertainty of land values in the region. Tom Hartley found out on a Wednesday and sent a rider to the Mercer Ranch that same afternoon. Naomi met the rider in the yard, read the message, and had Dale saddle the gray mare while she changed into her traveling coat. Dale looked at her. "You're going to the Hartley place?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Tom Hartley is not a threat to me," she said, "and he needs someone to talk to tonight who isn't going to panic at him." Dale looked like he wanted to argue. He looked at the mare instead. "She's still favoring that left front a little." "Then saddle the bay," she said, "and stop making reasons for me not to go." He saddled the bay. She rode out in the late afternoon light, which at this time of year had about an hour left in it before it gave up entirely. Tom Hartley was sitting at his kitchen table with a glass of something brown when she arrived, and James Hartley was standing by the window with his arms crossed, and both of them looked at her when she came in with the expression of men who had been arguing and were briefly united by an external arrival. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Tom said. "Mr. Hartley." She sat down without being invited, which she knew would either irritate him or establish the right tone immediately. She'd calculated it was the latter. "Tell me exactly what the bank's man said." Tom told her. He was a precise man when he wasn't frightened, and tonight the fear was making him less precise. But she listened through it and picked out the actual facts from the anxiety wrapped around them. When he was done, she said, "They didn't call the loan." "Not yet." "They suggested a review," she said, "which is not the same thing and you know it. A review can go nowhere. A review is a pressure tactic, not a legal action." She folded her hands on the table. "What Voss is trying to do is make you feel like the ground is shifting so you'll move before you have to." James, from the window, said, "And if the ground actually shifts?" "Then we deal with it when it shifts," she said, "not before. If you respond to a threat that hasn't materialized yet, you've given Voss exactly what he wanted, which is you out of the coalition before the March hearing." Silence. Tom turned the glass in his hands. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a face that showed every difficult year he'd lived, and right now it was showing several of them at once. "It's my land," he said. "My father homesteaded that south pasture. If I lose it, because I bet on a lawsuit, you'll lose it faster if you don't," she said. "If Western Territorial wins the boundary claim, they control the spring. You know what your water costs go to then. You've already done that calculation, or you wouldn't have joined the coalition in the first place." He looked at her. "Mercer's in Cheyenne." "Yes." "You're speaking for him?" She looked at Tom Hartley steadily and said something she'd thought through carefully on the ride over. "I'm speaking for the situation, which is that you have approximately 48 hours before this pressure tactic either lands or doesn't, and if you make a decision in those 48 hours based on fear rather than facts, you'll regret it for a long time." She paused. "I'll send a message to Marsh tonight. He needs to know what Voss has done. This kind of interference with coalition members. A lawyer like Marsh may be able to use it." James turned from the window. "How?" "Because it demonstrates that Western Territorial is willing to use financial coercion to break a legal challenge," she said. "That's relevant information for a territorial court to have." The two brothers looked at each other. Whatever argument they'd been having when she arrived appeared to have reached a different conclusion in the last few minutes. "You think Marsh can work with it?" Tom asked. "I think Marsh likes evidence of bad behavior more than almost anything," she said. "Write down exactly what the bank's man said, as precisely as you remember it, word for word if you can manage it." She stood up. "I'll send the message tonight." She rode back in the full dark, which was cold enough to make her eyes water, and when she got back to the ranch, she sat down and wrote 2 messages, one to Marsh, one to Gideon, and had Dale arrange for both to be sent by morning. Gideon's message was short. It said, Voss moved against Hartley through the bank. Tom is holding. Marsh needs to know. I've handled it, but come back when you can. She almost added something else. She stopped herself, sent it as it was. His response came 2 days later. 4 words. Coming back Friday. Good work. She read it twice, folded it, put it in her coat pocket next to the Christmas note. She didn't examine why she kept the notes. Or rather, she examined it once and then decided that level of self-scrutiny was not currently productive, and moved on. Marsh's response to the bank situation was, as she'd predicted, deeply interested. He sent back a message within 36 hours asking for Tom Hartley's written account and saying that if the interference could be documented, even partially, it could be presented as evidence of Western Territorial's pattern of behavior, which would be relevant to the fraud investigation that was building around the altered survey. He also said something at the end of his message that Naomi read 3 times. The woman managing the Mercer Ranch in Gideon's absence has better strategic instincts than most lawyers I've worked with. Tell her I said so. She didn't tell anyone he said so. She kept it. Gideon came back on a Friday, as promised, and he was different again, different from even the man who'd left 3 weeks earlier. He'd been living inside the legal machinery of the case for 20 days, and it showed, not in weariness exactly, but in a particular focused intensity, like a fire that had been stoked to a specific temperature and held there. He came into the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon, dropped his bag by the door, and sat down at the table. And Naomi poured him coffee and sat across from him, and he said, "Tell me everything." She told him. The Hartley Bank situation, her visit, the message to Marsh, Marsh's response about using it as evidence. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was actually processing it rather than waiting to respond. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "Marsh told me about your message," he said. "He told me how you framed it." "Did he have concerns about my framing?" "No," he said. He stopped, looked at the table. "He said you thought like a lawyer." "That's not a compliment I've ever received before," she said. "I think he meant it as one." She watched him for a moment. He was holding the coffee cup and not drinking it, a sign she'd learned that something was running underneath what he was saying. "What else did Marsh say?" she asked. He looked up. "He said the case is stronger than it's ever been. Cutter is credible and prepared. The field notes are solid. The bank interference gives them a pattern argument. And—" He stopped again. "And?" He set the cup down. "Voss's legal team filed a motion last week to have Cutter declared mentally incompetent on the basis of his age and a medical opinion from a doctor in Denver that nobody has ever heard of." He said it flatly, the way he said things that angered him when he was trying to manage the anger. They're trying to destroy a 73-year-old man's reputation to preserve a fraudulent boundary claim. The kitchen was quiet. "What did Marsh do?" Naomi asked. He filed a counter-motion with testimony from Cutter's personal physician in Laramie and from the Territorial Surveyor's Office, who worked with Cutter for 12 years and will testify to his professional conduct and mental acuity. He paused. He also asked me if Cutter had said anything during our conversations that would be useful for the competency counter-argument. Had he? A brief silence. He had a better memory for the details of that 1871 survey than I have for things that happened last year, Gideon said. He remembered the color of the creek water on the day he took the measurements. He remembered the name of his field assistant, who died in 1879. He remembered that the light was coming from the east at a low angle because it was late afternoon. He shook his head. Marsh is going to have him describe the survey from memory in court, in sequence, and then compare it to the field notes. If the notes match his memory, the judge will see immediately that this is a man who knows exactly what he did and exactly what got changed, Naomi said. Yes. She thought about Elias Cutter, a 73-year-old man in Laramie who had spent his working life measuring and recording the land honestly and had retired believing that one discrepancy had slipped past him without being his fault, and who was now being called incompetent by lawyers paid by the people who had actually created that discrepancy. "He'll be all right on the stand," she said. It wasn't a question. "He's angry," Gideon said. "In the good way. The way you said, where anger makes you more precise instead of less." February came in gray and stayed gray, and the ranch moved through its winter routine with the particular doggedness of a place that has been doing this long enough to know that spring will eventually show up regardless of how unlikely it currently seems. The change between Gideon and Naomi was not dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that could be pointed to and described precisely. It was more like the slow emergence of something that had been there for a while and was only now becoming visible. The way a frozen river shows you, in March, where the water was running underneath all winter. He had started asking her things differently. Not what she thought about the case or what she'd observed about a practical problem. Those had been there for months. Now he asked her things that didn't have utility attached to them. What she'd thought about before she came to Wyoming, whether she missed Colorado, what kind of work she'd wanted to do when she was young, before everything else. She answered honestly, because she'd decided honesty was the only way she was willing to operate with this man, even when honesty was harder than something softer would have been. She told him that before she married Franklin, she'd wanted to study land management, that she'd had an aptitude for the legal and practical side of land ownership from early on, and had always thought there was work to be done in helping people understand what they actually owned and what rights attached to it. That Franklin had found this interesting for approximately 1 year, and then found it inconvenient, and then found it threatening, and by the end she'd stopped mentioning it. Gideon listened to this without the discomfort that men sometimes showed when the story of a woman's diminishment was laid out clearly in front of them. He just listened. "That's what you've been doing here," he said, "the whole time." "Yes," she said. "You know you're better at it than most men who do it professionally." "I know," she said, not arrogantly, just accurately. He looked at her with that expression she still didn't have a clean name for. "After this is settled," he said carefully, "the boundary case. When it's done, have you thought about what you'd do next?" The question landed with more weight than it appeared to carry, and they both knew it. "Some," she said. "And?" She looked at him across the kitchen table in the gray February light, with the fire going and the wind doing its ordinary Wyoming work outside the window. "I haven't finished thinking about it," she said, which was true, and which told him something without saying it, and which he received without pushing further. "All right," he said, and let it be ciao. The crisis came on a Saturday in mid-February, and it came from an unexpected direction. There was a meeting, a coalition gathering at the Brennan place. Gideon, Naomi, Brennan, the Hartleys, Okafor, and 2 additional ranchers who'd asked to join after hearing about the case's progress. A total of 9 people in Brennan's front room, going over the March hearing preparations with a copy of Marsh's brief that had arrived the previous day. It was going well, or as well as these meetings went, which meant there was productive disagreement, not just agreement, and the disagreement was about strategy rather than commitment. Then Brennan made a reference that changed everything. He was talking about the spring, about access rights, about what the coalition wanted the post-ruling arrangement to look like. And he said, in the middle of a longer point about water allocation, which is why Gideon's arrangement needs to be flexible, especially once he and his wife have had time to look at the long term. He stopped himself, looked up, seemed to realize what he'd said. "Sorry," Brennan said, his voice easy, dismissive. "Gideon and his Miss Ashcroft, I should say. Force of habit. The way you two run things, a man just—" He waved a hand. A small gesture meant to smooth it over. "Anyway, the point is," he kept talking. The meeting kept moving. Most of the people in the room let it go without landing, but Naomi had gone very still. Not visibly. She was too experienced at keeping her surface steady for that. But she'd gone still in the way she went still when something landed that she needed to process carefully before she responded to it, or didn't respond to it. His wife. She looked at Gideon. He was looking at the brief in his hands. He'd heard it. She could tell by the way his jaw had moved once, briefly, but he hadn't corrected Brennan. He'd let it pass. And then he'd kept going, and the meeting had kept going, and Brennan had moved on to the next point, and nobody had said anything. She understood, on one level, why he hadn't corrected it. Correcting it would have made it a larger moment than it needed to be. It would have required a clarification of what Naomi actually was, and what she wasn't, and that clarification would have been awkward and disruptive, and would have taken the meeting somewhere it didn't need to go. She understood all of that. But understanding it and feeling it were different things, because what she'd felt, in the moment that Gideon didn't speak, was the old familiar sensation she'd spent years living with under Franklin's roof, the feeling of being someone whose identity was defined by the man she stood near, whose presence was assumed rather than acknowledged, whose actual self was a detail that could be smoothed over with a wave of a hand. his wife. Force of habit. Anyway, she sat through the rest of the meeting and said two more useful things and asked one sharp question about the survey timeline, and she looked fine. She was good at looking fine. She'd had a lot of practice. But when the meeting ended and people gathered their coats and horses and began the ride back to their respective properties, she found herself doing a calculation she hadn't planned on doing. She cataloged the ways the ranch had changed, the things she'd taken on without being asked, the ways the house ran differently now, the way Gideon looked at her, talked to her, depended on her judgment, the way the hands called her ma'am with a particular respect that had nothing in it of guest or stranger. And she asked herself honestly whether she had let herself become essential in a way that had snuck up on her without her full consent. Whether she had, without noticing the moment it happened, begun to disappear into this place. That night, she sat on the edge of her bed in the cook's quarters and thought about it for a long time. About Brennan's casual correction, or non-correction. About the wave of the hand. About force of habit, which implied that the habit had been forming long enough that people had simply settled on an assumption without anyone asking. She thought about Franklin, about the early years when things had still felt like her own, and how gradually and almost invisibly they had stopped being so. She thought about the fact that she had not, at any point, had a clear conversation with Gideon Mercer about what she was doing here and what she wanted and what she was afraid of. That they had circled those things in conversation after conversation and had both been careful and cautious and had communicated a great deal without actually saying much. And she thought about what it would mean to leave this place having never said any of it. She got up. She opened the chest at the foot of the bed. She took out her traveling bag, the same worn leather bag she'd arrived with, and she began, quietly and methodically, to put things in it. Not quickly, not in panic, with the calm deliberateness of someone who has made a decision they're not happy about but believe is correct. She packed her clothes, her books, the notes she'd made during the legal case, the copy of the land record summary she'd written for Marsh. She left the Christmas note on the small table beside the bed. She was not sure why. She just couldn't put it in the bag. It was past midnight when Dale knocked on the cook's quarters door. She hadn't told anyone, but Dale knew this ranch the way old men know a place they've given decades to. Not every detail, but the shape of things. The sound of things that weren't right. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, through the door. She didn't answer immediately. "I saw the light," he said. "Just wanted to make sure everything was all right." "Go to bed, Dale," she said. A pause. "You're packing," he said. Not accusing, just saying the fact of it. "Yes." "Tonight?" "No, morning." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear him standing there, deciding. "Should I wake the boss?" he said. "No," she said. "Don't do that. He'll want to know." "I know he will," she said. "Don't wake him." She heard Dale stand there for another moment. Then his footsteps moved away down the hall, and she was alone again with the open bag and the things that needed to go into it, and the specific hollow feeling of having made a decision she believed was right but did not want to be making. She sat down on the edge of the bed, looked at the bag, looked at the note on the table. Outside, the Wyoming dark was solid and cold and very quiet. She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard the front door of the house open. She heard footsteps, not Dale's, moving through the kitchen, stopping outside the cook's quarters. A knock. "Naomi?" She closed her eyes for a moment. "Naomi," Gideon said through the door. His voice was quiet and even and had something underneath it that she hadn't heard in it before. "I know it's the middle of the night. I know you told Dale not to wake me." A pause. "He didn't wake me. I heard you from the study. The walls here are not as thick as you think." Another pause. "Come outside. I need to talk to you, and I'd rather do it where I can see your face." She sat still for a long moment. Then she stood up. She didn't put her coat on. She opened the door. He was standing in the hallway in his work clothes. He'd never been to bed, she realized. He'd been in the study when she'd started packing. He looked at her. He looked at the open bag behind her, visible through the doorway. His face did something careful and complicated. "Come outside," he said again. She followed him through the kitchen and out the back door into the February dark. The cold hit immediately, sharp, clean, with a sky full of stars that were very bright because the moon had set. They stood in the yard, not close. She crossed her arms against the cold but didn't ask to go back in. "Brennan," he said. "Yes." I should have corrected him. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He looked at her directly. No hedging, no deflection. "I didn't because I was afraid of what the correction would imply. Whether it would sound like I was denying something or claiming something, and either way, I didn't know how to make it come out honest." He paused. "That was wrong. I let my own discomfort make a decision that wasn't mine to make." She listened to that, gave it the weight it deserved. "It wasn't just Brennan," she said. "It was—" She stopped, tried to find the accurate language for something she'd been sitting with for hours. "I packed that bag because I needed to ask myself something honestly. Whether I've been losing myself here the way I lost myself before. Whether I've let myself become—" She searched for the word. "Assumed by this place. By you." The stars were very bright. Somewhere a horse moved in the barn. "And?" he said. "And I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know whether I'm building something here or disappearing into something. And I don't know because we've never actually talked about it. We've talked around it. For months. Very carefully and very successfully around it." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different than she'd heard it. Stripped of the management, the carefulness, the considered presentation. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "That's the truth I've been keeping. I know how to run a ranch. I know how to fight a lawsuit. I know how to sit across from a woman at a kitchen table and talk about land records until I realize I've been waiting for that part of the day for weeks." He stopped. "I don't know what comes after that. I've spent so long being certain that there was nothing after that, that I wasn't someone who got to have that. That I don't know how to move forward without being afraid of breaking it." She looked at him in the dark. He was standing with his hands at his sides, and he looked neither weak nor guarded, just plainly, uncomfortably honest. "I'm not going to become someone's background," she said. "Not again. I can't do that. Whatever else I am or am not willing to do, I can't be the thing that holds a house together while the person at the center of the house forgets to see me." "I see you," he said. "I know you do right now," she said. "I'm asking whether you'd see me in 5 years. Whether it would still occur to you to say it in a room full of people when someone gets it wrong." The question sat between them in the cold. He took a long breath. "Let it out." "I don't know," he said. "I'd like to promise you I would, but I don't know. I've never had to hold on to someone before. I've only ever had to let go." He paused. "What I can tell you is that I know what it costs when I don't speak. I know what it costs you, and I know what it costs me, and I don't want to pay that anymore." He looked at her. "But I need you to tell me when I'm getting it wrong. Not pack a bag in the middle of the night. Tell me. Because I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. Not because I see you as a possession or a convenience. Because I'm a man who spent 14 years being certain he was better off alone, and that habit doesn't disappear in 3 months." The cold was deep, and the stars were very bright, and she stood in the yard of the Mercer Ranch in the middle of a Wyoming night looking at a man who was telling her the truth, not the polished version, not the version that would make her stay, just the actual truth, with its rough edges intact. She thought about Franklin, about the difference between a man who had never questioned his right to consume and a man who was standing in the cold admitting that he didn't know how to not be afraid. The difference was not nothing. "You have to say it," she said, "when someone gets it wrong. In the room. Not later. Not in private. In the room." "Yes," he said, "and you have to mean it when you ask me things, not just when it's useful." "I already mean it," he said. "That's not a problem I have with you. The problem I have is—" He stopped. "You terrify me," he said. "Is that plain enough? You walked into this place and you saw everything clearly, and you made it better without asking my permission, and you never pretended to be less than you are. And that combination is, I don't have a word for what it is. I just know I don't want to watch you right away." She looked at him. She thought about the open bag, about Brennan's hand wave, about the Christmas note she'd left on the table and hadn't been able to put in the bag. "I'm not riding away tonight," she said. Something moved through his face. Not relief exactly, something more complicated than relief, with more weight in it. "Tomorrow?" he said. "I don't know about tomorrow," she said. "I know about tonight." He nodded, a single, honest nod. "That's enough," he said. "For tonight, that's enough." They stood in the cold for another moment. Then she went inside and he followed, and she went to the cook's quarters and looked at the bag for a long time before she began, quietly and without any particular ceremony, to take things back out of it. She left the Christmas note where it was, on the table where she'd put it. Outside, the Wyoming night did what it always did, held everything in cold and dark and silence, indifferent to the small human decisions being made beneath it, while the stars burned on without comment or conclusion. She didn't mention the bag in the morning, neither did he. What happened instead was that she made breakfast at the usual hour, and he came in at the usual time, and Dale came in after him, and Coop and the others filed through, and the kitchen did what it always did, absorbed people and noise and the particular hunger of men who had been working since before sunup. Nobody said anything about the middle of the night. Nobody referenced the conversation in the yard. It was not avoidance, exactly. It was more like an agreement, unspoken and mutual, that what had been said and didn't need to be performed again in daylight. But something was different, and everyone in that kitchen felt it without being able to name it. Dale poured his own coffee that morning without waiting to be served, which he never did, and Naomi understood that he was giving her space, his version of respect, which looked like small acts of practical self-sufficiency. Coop, for reasons known only to himself, did not say a single opinionated thing during the entire meal, which was unprecedented. Even the two youngest hands seemed to sense that the atmosphere required a certain level of consideration, and ate their food without the usual elbow competition. Gideon sat at his end of the table and ate and read a letter that had arrived from Marsh, and once, only once, he looked up and caught Naomi's eyes across the room, and neither of them said anything, and she went back to the stove. That was February. They still had 3 weeks until the hearing. The weeks moved differently now. Not slower or faster, just with more texture, more awareness of the space between people and what that space contained. Gideon kept his word in the small ways first, which was how Naomi knew the large ways would follow. When the supply merchant came to the ranch the following week and referred to Naomi, in Gideon's presence, with the particular dismissiveness of a man who has already categorized the women in a room as your housekeeper, Gideon said, without hesitation and without drama. She's been managing the legal documentation on the boundary case. You might want to address your questions about the supply contract to her. The merchant blinked, looked at Naomi, looked back at Gideon, made the small recalibration that people made when the ground they'd assumed turned out to be different from the actual ground. Naomi said nothing, but later, when the merchant had gone, she was in the barn checking on the gray mare, and Gideon came in and stood near the stall and didn't say anything for a moment. I know it wasn't a grand gesture, he said. It didn't need to be grand, she said. It just needed to be real. He nodded. She went back to the horse. He stayed for a moment, then left, and the gray mare made a low sound that might have been commentary. The conversations between them opened up in ways they hadn't before. Not because the middle-of-the-night confrontation had resolved everything, but because it had established that they were both willing to say the hard things when the hard things needed saying. That was its own kind of foundation, not a comfortable one, but a real one. She told him more about Colorado, about the years before Franklin, when she'd been sharp and interested and had believed her particular way of seeing things had value. About the gradual process of being convinced it didn't, not through cruelty, but through the slower erosion of 1,000 small dismissals that she hadn't recognized as a pattern until she was deep inside it. He told her about the years after his engagement ended, about the way he'd methodically restructured his entire life around self-sufficiency, not as a response to grief, though it had started there, but as a project. He'd decided that need was weakness, and weakness was exposure, and exposure was intolerable, and he'd built the ranch on those premises, and the ranch had thrived, and he had been, by most external measures, fine. But it's a strange kind of fine, he said, the kind that doesn't notice it's empty because it stopped letting anything fill it. She looked at him across the kitchen table. When did you notice? He thought about it. I'm not sure I noticed, he said. I think you just walked in and the contrast was apparent. She almost smiled at that. Didn't quite get there, but almost. That's a very controlled way of admitting something significant, she said. I'm working on it, he said. And this time something in his expression got close enough to humor that she let herself respond to it. Marsh sent a final briefing on the Monday before the hearing. The coalition was to present their counter-challenge on a Thursday. Elias Cutter would testify first, followed by a deposition from the Territorial Surveyor's Office, followed by testimony from Okafor and Brennan about historical water use. Marsh had filed the bank interference documentation as supplemental evidence of Western Territorial's conduct pattern, and the Territorial Prosecutor's Office had sent a letter indicating they were watching the proceedings with interest. Gideon read the briefing aloud to Naomi and Dale at the kitchen table. When he finished, Dale looked at the table for a moment. "Feels real now," Dale said. "It's been real," Gideon said. "I know. But this kind of real is different." Dale picked up his coffee. "What happens if the judge doesn't rule our way?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Then Marsh files an appeal and we fight it in a higher court." "That could take years." "Yes." Dale nodded slowly. He looked at Naomi. "You going to still be here for years?" The question landed honestly, without agenda, just an old man asking the thing that was on his mind. Naomi looked at Dale, and then she looked at Gideon, and Gideon was looking at her with an expression that was doing its level best to not be asking the same question, but was not entirely succeeding. "I'll be here for the hearing," she said. "After that, we'll see what needs doing." Dale accepted this. He was a practical man, and he understood that some answers had to be earned by time rather than extracted by questions. They rode to the Territorial Courthouse in Cheyenne on a Wednesday. Gideon, Naomi, Dale, Brennan, the Hartleys, and Okafor. A party of 7, making the winter journey together with the particular gravity of people who have committed to a thing and are now in the final approach to it. The courthouse was a stone building on a wide street, solid and deliberate in the way of institutions that want to communicate permanence. Inside, it smelled like paper and wood smoke and the particular mustiness of a building where serious decisions had been accumulating for years. Marsh met them in the corridor outside the main hearing room. He was in his good coat, which was still not a particularly impressive coat, and he was carrying an amount of paper that suggested he had prepared for every conceivable eventuality. He shook Gideon's hand, nodded at the coalition members, and then looked at Naomi. "The survey discrepancy summary you wrote," he said. "I'm going to reference it during the Cutter examination. The judge has a copy." "All right," she said. "The way you explained the relationship between the filed map and the survey text, I've had lawyers who couldn't do that as clearly in 10 pages. He said it with the directness of a man who didn't traffic in unnecessary compliments. Whatever you decide to do after this is over, you should consider that you have a talent for this." She looked at him. "I'll keep it in mind." He went back to his papers. Gideon, who had been standing just behind her, said nothing, but she felt him listening. Elias Cutter arrived with his daughter, a woman in her 40s who had her father's sharp eyes and a protective alertness about her that Naomi recognized as the particular vigilance of someone who has watched a person they love be attacked. Cutter himself was smaller than Naomi had imagined from Gideon's descriptions, thin and precise, with white hair and the hands of a man who had spent his working life holding instruments and making marks on paper with the understanding that those marks would matter. He sat in the chair beside Marsh's table and looked around the courtroom with the alert calm of someone who has made peace with the situation he's in. Western Territorial's legal team sat on the other side of the room. 3 lawyers, all from Denver, all in better coats than Marsh. At the head of their table sat a man Naomi had not seen before but recognized immediately from everything she'd been told. Harlan Voss. Medium height, expensive suit. The face of a man who had spent years in rooms like this one and believed that rooms like this one were ultimately manageable if you knew the right people and applied the right pressures. He glanced at the coalition side of the room when they filed in. His eyes moved across the group with the evaluative efficiency of a man pricing livestock. And when they landed on Naomi, they paused for a half second, the brief assessment of someone encountering a variable they hadn't fully accounted for, and then moved on. She held his gaze for the half second. She didn't look away first. The hearing ran for 2 full days. Marsh was methodical and unhurried in the way of someone who knows the ground under him is solid and doesn't need to rush. He walked Cutter through the 1871 survey with the patience of a craftsman, slowly, precisely, letting the old man's memory do the work that no amount of legal argument could replicate. Cutter described the creek that day in October of 1871 the way Gideon had said he would, with the sensory specificity of lived experience, the color of the water, the afternoon light, the position of his field assistant, the exact measurements he'd taken and recorded and signed. Then Marsh put the field notes beside the filed map, and walked the judge through the 12-yard discrepancy and asked Cutter directly whether the map reflected his survey. Cutter looked at the map for a long moment. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that has been wrong for a long time and is finally being named. "No," he said, "it does not." "Can you explain the discrepancy?" "Someone moved the creek marker 12 yards west on this map," Cutter said. "My survey placed it here." He pointed. "This map places it there. Those are not the same place. I did not draw this map." Western Territorial's lead lawyer spent most of the next morning trying to suggest that Cutter's memory was unreliable, that 12 yards over 52 years was within a reasonable margin of error, that the map had been produced through an official process that Cutter himself had not been present for. Cutter listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has been doing careful work his entire life and has nothing to be defensive about. When the lawyer finished, the judge asked Cutter one question. "Mr. Cutter, you mentioned your field notes. In your professional experience as a territorial surveyor, how often did your field notes contain errors?" Cutter thought about this seriously, not defensively, but genuinely. "I made 11 errors in 22 years of surveying," he said. "I documented every one of them in the annual report to the territorial office. You can look them up. None of them involved a creek marker position." The courtroom was very quiet. On Western Territorial's side of the room, Voss made a small movement, not visible to most people, but Naomi was watching him, and she saw it. A slight shift in his posture, the recalibration of a man who has just understood that the outcome he'd been certain of is no longer certain. What? The second day was the coalition testimony, and it was Brennan who surprised everyone. Brennan was not a subtle man. He was 63 years old and had spent his whole life in direct physical relationship with the land he owned. And when he sat down to testify about historical water use, he spoke the way he did everything, without ornamentation, without performance, just the plain truth of 30 years of living next to that spring and knowing what it meant. He talked about drought years, about the families who had survived because of access to water that no individual ranch could have sustained alone. He talked about a family whose cattle had made it through a terrible winter because the Mercer spring had kept running when everything else froze. He named them. He looked at the judge while he named them. "That water doesn't belong to a company in Denver," Brennan said. "It belongs to the people who have been living on this land since before most people in Denver knew Wyoming existed." Western Territorial's lawyer objected to the characterization. The judge overruled it. Okafor testified after Brennan, and where Brennan had been forceful, Okafor was precise. Dates, volumes, usage records, he had kept himself in a ledger that went back 12 years. The lawyer tried to challenge his record-keeping methodology. Okafor explained it so clearly and so completely that the challenge simply stopped. By the end of the second afternoon, even the air in the courtroom felt different. The judge took 2 days to deliberate, and in those 2 days the coalition waited in Cheyenne, scattered across 2 boarding houses and Marsh's office. And the waiting had the particular quality that waiting always has when the outcome matters enough to be physically uncomfortable. Gideon was not good at waiting. Naomi had known this, but 2 days in a boarding house sitting room confirmed it. He was up early, he moved around too much. He read the same page of the same document 3 times without absorbing it. On the evening of the first waiting day, they walked together, not by plan, just by the coincidence of both needing air at the same time. Cheyenne in March was cold, but not brutal, with a tentative quality to the light that suggested spring was considering its options. They walked down the main street and didn't talk much. That was one of the things she'd come to understand about being with Gideon, that silence didn't require filling, that he was one of the rare people who could be quiet with another person without it becoming a statement. After a while he said, "Whatever the judge decides, it's going to go the right way," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she said, "but I've sat through 2 days of that hearing and I know what was presented, and I know what Cutter's testimony did to their case." She looked at the street ahead of them. "It's going to go the right way." He was quiet for a moment. "And if it does?" She looked at him. "After," he said. "When we go back. When this is over." He stopped walking. She stopped too. They stood on the sidewalk in the March evening with the last of the light going pink at the edges of the sky. "I don't want to be careful anymore," he said. "I've been careful for 3 months, and careful it's necessary. I understand why we've both been careful, but I'm done with it." He looked at her directly. I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs managing or because the legal case needs someone who can read a land survey. Because I want you there. Because I'm better with you in the house than without you, and I know the difference now, and I don't want to go back to not knowing. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Franklin. She thought about 8 years of slow erasure. She thought about the bag she'd packed and unpacked. She thought about the merchant and the supply contract and Gideon saying address your questions to her without hesitation. She thought about what it actually meant to trust someone. Not the feeling of trust, which could be manufactured by hope or need or loneliness, but the decision of trust. The deliberate choice to extend yourself toward another person and accept the vulnerability that came with it, not because they were perfect, but because they were honest about being imperfect. She had been waiting, she realized, for certainty, for the kind of guarantee that didn't exist between human beings, the assurance that she wouldn't lose herself again, that he wouldn't change, that the ground would hold forever. And she'd been waiting for it because the alternative felt like risk, and risk felt like the thing that had already cost her 8 years. But standing on a Cheyenne sidewalk in the last of the March light, she understood something she'd been circling for months without landing on. The risk was not the problem. The risk was the only honest thing available. The question was whether the person you were taking it with was worth taking it with. Whether they were the kind of person who would notice when they got it wrong and say so, and stand in a cold yard in the middle of the night and tell you the truth about their fear, rather than a version of it that made them look better. She knew the answer to that question. "I'll stay," she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Not quite relief and not quite joy. Something that had both of those in it and something older and quieter underneath. The particular expression of someone who has been alone for long enough that company still surprises them sometimes, even when they chose it. "Are you sure?" he said. He asked it not to question her, but because he needed to hear her say it in the full weight of its meaning. "Ask me something I'm not sure of," she said. He almost laughed. It didn't quite make it all the way out, but it got closer than anything she'd seen from him before. They walked back to the boarding house, and the sky went dark over Cheyenne. And the next day, the judge delivered his ruling. He ruled in full for the coalition, not partially, not with qualifications. Western Territorial's boundary claim was denied on the grounds that the filed survey map of 1871 did not accurately reflect the surveyor of record's actual field measurements. A discrepancy the court found consistent with deliberate alteration rather than drafting error, given the specificity of Cutter's testimony and the existence of original field notes that contradicted the filed document. He further ordered that the matter be referred to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation into potential fraud against the territory. He noted in his written ruling, which Marsh read aloud to the coalition that afternoon in his small office with everyone crowded in shoulder to shoulder, that the joint counter-challenge represented an unusual degree of community organization, and that the quality of the documentary evidence presented, particularly the survey discrepancy analysis, had materially assisted the court in understanding a complex technical dispute. Brennan, when Marsh finished reading, said, "Is it done?" "It's done," Marsh said. Tom Hartley put his face in his hands. Not crying, just absorbing it. His brother James put a hand on his shoulder and left it there. Okafor, who had been quiet throughout, said, "The spring is free." "The spring is free," Marsh confirmed. Gideon stood at the edge of the room and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then he looked at Naomi, who was standing near the door, and something passed between them that didn't require translation. The investigation into Western Territorial took the better part of the following year and ultimately resulted in criminal charges against 2 of the company's senior officers for filing a fraudulent document with the territorial government. Voss himself was not charged. His lawyers managed to establish sufficient distance between him and the specific act of alteration. But the company's operating licenses in the Wyoming territory were suspended pending review, and the investors who had backed the scheme found themselves unwilling to absorb the financial exposure and withdrew. Western Territorial Holdings ceased operations in the territory by the following autumn. Harlan and Voss went back to Denver. There were reports, in subsequent years, of similar schemes attempted in other territories, with varying success. He was, as Naomi had known from the beginning, not the kind of man who learned from failure, only from the particular kind of failure that finally ran out of road. Aldous Fitch sold his ranch 2 years later, not because he had to, the legal outcome had left his land intact, but because, as he told the buyer, he'd spent 30 years in Wyoming and was tired of the winters. Nobody in the territory expressed strong feelings about his departure. They were married in April, when the ground had softened enough that the first things were coming up in the kitchen garden. Naomi had started in March. Not flowers, nothing decorative, just practical things, herbs and root vegetables, and a row of beans that wouldn't produce until summer. The planting had been entirely her idea, and Gideon had built the low fence around it without being asked and without commenting on the fact that he'd built it. And she had noticed and not commented on that either, and this was how they operated. The ceremony was small. Brennan and his wife, the Hartleys. Okafor, who brought a bottle of something very good and said very little. Dale, who wore a clean shirt and spent most of the morning pretending he wasn't moved by the proceedings. Coop, who had grown up somewhat in the preceding months and demonstrated this by not saying a single thing inappropriate. Naomi's sister, who had traveled from Casper and arrived 2 days early, and spent both days in the kitchen with Naomi in a state of sustained practical conversation that managed to cover 8 months of missed connection in the way that people who have known each other their whole lives can do, not by going backward through everything that happened, but by simply starting again from where they are. The ceremony was conducted by the county judge, who was a sensible man and kept it short and plain. When it was over, Brennan shook Gideon's hand and said, "You look like a man who finally let something good happen to him." Gideon said, "I had help." Brennan looked at Naomi. "Yes," he said. "You did." And there was something in the way he said it, a directness, an acknowledgement, that told Naomi he remembered the meeting in his front room in January and the word he'd used then and what it had cost. It was the closest thing to an apology that Brennan was capable of producing, and she accepted it as such. The ranch changed over the following years in ways that were real and imperfect and ongoing. Gideon got better at asking for help. Not natural, better. There's a difference, and it matters. He still had days when the old self-sufficiency closed around him like a fist, when he retreated to the study and the silence and the particular certainty that problems were solved alone. On those days, Naomi left the study door open and made coffee and let him find his way back, because she'd learned that the only way to stay in a partnership with a complicated person was to trust that the partnership itself could hold the weight of their difficult days without requiring constant management. She was not, for her part, easy. She knew this about herself. She was direct in ways that occasionally made people flinch. She had opinions about things that were not her business, and sometimes expressed them anyway. She had mornings when the old fear came back. Not the large fear, not the Franklin fear, but the smaller chronic fear that she would look up one day and find herself invisible again, swallowed by routine and assumption. On those mornings she said so, not gracefully, not without friction, but out loud, which was what mattered. He always listened, not always well. Sometimes he listened badly or defensively or missed the actual point and addressed the surface of it. But he never stopped. He never suggested she was being unreasonable for feeling what she felt. And he got better, over time, at hearing the thing underneath the thing she was saying. It wasn't a love story in the way that love stories are usually told, with a clear arc toward resolution and a final moment of perfect understanding. It was a working arrangement between two people who had both been significantly damaged by the time they found each other, who chose, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to keep showing up. Some mornings that choice was easy. Some mornings it was the hardest thing either of them did all day. Both kinds of mornings were real, and both kinds of mornings were theirs. The kitchen garden came in that summer, and Naomi expanded it the following spring. More beans, tomatoes, a section of herbs that the ranch hands started using without being told, which she took as the highest possible form of appreciation. Gideon built a second fence section without being asked. She noticed. He knew she noticed. Dale retired the following autumn, and a younger foreman took over, a serious woman from Nebraska named Ruth Carver, who had more experience than anyone on the ranch and knew it and did not apologize for knowing it. Naomi hired her. Gideon approved the hire after a 15-minute conversation and said afterward that he'd known in the first 3 minutes, but had asked the remaining questions out of courtesy. Elias Cutter died the following winter at 74, in his daughter's house in Laramie, peacefully and apparently without regret. The Territorial Surveyor's Office held a small memorial and noted in their public record that Cutter had, in the final year of his life, corrected a professional wrong that had stood for over 50 years and done so with the precision and integrity that had characterized his entire career. Naomi read the notice in the territorial paper and sat with it for a few minutes before folding it and putting it away. She thought about what it meant to be a person who did honest work, who measured things accurately and recorded them accurately, and refused to let that accuracy be overwritten, even quietly, even when it would have been easier not to notice. She thought about how much of the world depended on people like Cutter, people who just kept the record straight, and how rarely they were thanked for it until after. She thought about her own years of careful observation, the thing that Dale had said to her in the root cellar in November, that she noticed a lot of things. She thought about where that ability had come from, which was years of living in a situation where attention was survival, where seeing clearly was the only way to navigate a reality that wanted to be something other than what it was. She thought about the fact that those years had cost her a great deal and had also, in ways she couldn't have designed or chosen, made her into someone capable of walking into a stranger's ranch in a blizzard and reading the situation clearly enough to be useful. You don't get to choose which experiences shape you. You only get to choose what you do with what they've made. Years later, enough years that the legal fight had become something the younger hands knew only as a story, something that had happened before their time. A new hired man named Marcus, 22 years old and recently arrived from Ohio, asked Dale's successor why the ranch was the way it was. He meant it as a general question. Why did the Mercer Ranch run differently from other places he'd worked? Why the foreman was a woman? Why the owner's wife sat in on business meetings and asked questions that stopped conversations cold? Why the whole operation felt like it had been designed by people who'd thought hard about what they were building, and why? The answer he got was longer than he expected. It started with a blizzard in November of 1883, and a woman on a tired horse, and a gate that had every reason to stay closed and opened anyway. It went through land fraud and a 73-year-old surveyor and a coalition of ranchers who had learned, under considerable pressure, that there were things you could not do alone that you could do together. It went through a packed bag and a yard in the middle of a February night, and two people telling each other the truth after months of careful circling. Marcus listened to all of it and then said, "So she changed him." The older hand, a woman in her 50s who had worked the Mercer Ranch for 8 years, and knew its history the way you know a place you've given real time to, considered this for a moment. "No," she said. "She didn't change him. She stayed long enough that he figured out how to change himself." She picked up her coffee. "There's a difference. Most people never learn it." Marcus thought about that. I was still thinking about it a week later when he watched Gideon Mercer, 61 years old and slower than he'd been, but still precise in his judgments, stop in the middle of a conversation with a buyer from out of territory to correct him, firmly, without apology. When the man referred to a question about the water contract as something to sort out with the man in charge. "That would be my wife," Gideon said. "She's in the house. I'll let her know you're ready." The buyer looked momentarily uncertain about how to recalibrate. Gideon waited with the patience of someone who had learned, over many years and at considerable cost, that other people's discomfort with accurate information was not his problem to manage. Naomi came out a few minutes later with the contract documents and her reading glasses and the particular focused attention she brought to anything that required precision. She sat down at the table and opened the file and said, "All right, let's start with the escalation clause in paragraph 7, because that's where these things always go wrong." She said it the way she said most things, plainly, without softening, like someone who has finally settled into the full weight of herself and found it adequate. Outside, the kitchen garden was in its summer height, dense and various and entirely practical. The fence Gideon had built around it had been repaired twice now, replaced in one section, and would need attention again before winter. He would notice before she mentioned it. She knew that now. It had taken time, not as long as either of them had feared, and longer than either of them had hoped, which is usually how it goes with the things that actually last. Long enough to be real. Short enough to still have years ahead of it. The beans were coming in. The water still ran clear from the spring that no company in Denver owned. The gate at the south end of the Mercer Ranch had been unlocked since that November, and had stayed that way. Not because the danger was gone. Danger doesn't go away cleanly, and the world has always been full of men like Voss, who are patient and well-funded and willing to dress theft in the language of commerce. but because two people had decided, in the specific and imperfect way that real decisions get made, that a locked gate was not the same as safety. It was only isolation wearing safety's name. And isolation in the end was the thing that cost you more than anything Voss or anyone like him could have taken. That was the thing worth knowing, the thing that took the longest to learn and the shortest to lose if you stopped paying attention to it. Pay attention. Keep the record straight. Tell the truth in the room, not later, not in private, in the room. And when someone stands beside you in the dark and tells you the honest version of who they are, with all the roughness still in it, consider carefully before you decide that the risk is not worth taking. It might be the most important decision you ever make.